Hey everyone, I'm Lord Rumfish, and today I wanted to talk to you about Magic's block structure and the impact that it had on Magic's IP, its intellectual property, and its storytelling and immersion. Also want to talk about the mechanical impacts that blocks had and go over the pros and cons of them. They were not perfect, but maybe something got left behind. Um, that was actually crucial to the game. I'd like to explore that today. So up at the top of the screen here, you can see Mirrodin block. This is not the first block of the game. That was all the way back at Mirage. But 2003 is when I started playing the game. So the first expansion I bought very much of was 8th edition, and then Mirrodin came out in the fall. So I have a lot of nostalgia for this era of Magic here. But enough about me. As you can see by the number of cards that were in the sets, Mirrodin had 306, Darksteel and Fifth Dawn had 165. They used to structure the blocks as having one large set and two small sets. Now, they experimented with this in all kinds of different ways. They tried making the small sets bigger. They tried doing 2-set blocks instead of 3-set blocks. They went through many different iterations. I think one thing that they never quite tried to its full extent was doing what they do now, where they don't make small sets anymore, and just make every set of the block a full-sized set. Yeah, usually we don't have sets that are over 300 cards now, but they'll range usually from like 271 cards up to like 291 cards. And you would just do that for every set of the block. Now that would put more cards into standard, but if you've been playing Magic recently, you know that there were 5 big expansions this year. The next one coming is Foundations. Next year we've got 6 big expansions coming. So the concerns that they might have had back in these days when they made these blocks about having 3 large sets, apparently that's not a problem. Apparently they think they can do twice that many. They're going to do 6 large sets next year. So going back to this block model and making 3 large sets by comparison seems like nothing these days. Small sets had a lot of issues, but I have to wonder if some of those problems with blocks had to do with trying to make small sets. And if making all of the sets full-sized wouldn't sidestep some of those problems if they were to bring blocks back. Now, in terms of some of the other effects that blocks had on the game, I'd like to make a comparison here between a road trip and a vacation where you stay in one place. So, the way that Magic is now is more like a road trip, where every day you get on the road, you drive into a new place, you see like 1 or 2 of the magnificent sights of this place. Maybe a redwood forest, maybe a museum or an art gallery. Maybe you get to eat at one restaurant once at this place. You stay the night, and the next day, you move on. You go to another place and you see its sights. But you don't get to see the depth of the place you visit on a road trip. You're kind of grazing the surface, like an iceberg. So you get to see a wide variety of places. You get to travel a great distance and see many different things, but you don't ever stop and get a feel for what's happening at that place. You never eat at the same restaurant twice. You don't get down into the level of, what does the day-to-day life of that place feel like? Do you make a casual acquaintance or a friend during the time that you stay there? Do you begin to see some of the flaws or some of the hidden beauty of the place that you could not be aware of with only a surface level examination? And that's like if you go somewhere and you're able to stay there for 2 or 3 weeks and take like a long extended vacation and stay in one place. Experience all that it has to offer in great depth. Now, you don't get to see a lot of different places when you do that, but you become intimately familiar to some degree of what's going on in that place you're staying. And that's like the difference between current design, where every set is a different plane, or multiple planes now with the Death Race set coming up, or the old block model, where you would focus in on a place and the story that was unfolding and the characters and just the feel of that setting. And you would stay there for a year. It's a little bit unthinkable if you've only started playing Magic in the last few years. Let's scroll down here a little bit. So Amonkhet and Ixalan were the last two set blocks before they changed over to the 3-in-1 model, and blocks kind of went the way of the dodo bird. Now, that's been a while. That was, 2017, 2018? You could almost count in the 3-in-1 model down here that Guilds of Ravnica, Ravnica Allegiance, and War of the Spark all kind of felt like they happened at the same place, roughly at the same time, so that kind of feels a little bit like a block. If you count that, then, maybe you got a little bit of that block feeling all the way into 2019. But still, 2019 was 5 years ago. And a lot of people have started playing the game within the last 3 years. So it could be that some of you watching have never experienced a block of Magic. And if so, I want you to imagine that the pace of the releases have slowed down. That there are 3 major tentpole releases for Standard that are part of a block that all takes place in one place in roughly the same timeline, telling a story there. That happens over the course of a year. And then there's one extra set that comes out in the summertime. In this case, it's going to be like Foundations. It's a core set, probably. So there should be about, 3 to 4 sets that come out over the course of a year. And Standard has a 2-year rotation. So at the absolute biggest, maybe Standard has 8 sets in it, possibly, if you got like a core set and then another special set that sneaked its way in. Or maybe it's just 7 sets at the peak of 2 years before the big fall set hits and rotation occurs. Now this means at any given time there are 2 big stories that are happening in Standard. There are 2 places you're visiting simultaneously. And that gives you an awful lot of time to focus on what's happening on that plane, both in terms of the gameplay, like the mechanics. The downside, of course, is if you don't like that block, if you don't like what's happening on that plane, you're stuck with it for a year. And yeah, that could be annoying. yeah, blocks were not perfect. If you had a block that you didn't like, or it was making gameplay kind of miserable, that could be an issue. On the other hand, a lot of the time, blocks turned out to be pretty fun. You know, Magic survived for all the way from Mirage, all the way up to like 2018, 2019 with blocks. And most of the time, they did a pretty good job. Sometimes they'd have mixed reviews, sometimes they'd be well received, but there were only a few real duds as far as the blocks. And even then, like Mercadian Masks block, or some others that weren't well received when they first came out, like Kamigawa or Ixalan. They later became like kind of cult classics, fan favorites for a certain segment of the fan base. So even if it wasn't widely loved at the time, through the lens of nostalgia, people maybe gradually over time began to like it more. That's a funny thing. Just like the stories of Gerard and the Weatherlight Saga that took place over multiple blocks. There was quite a bit of grief that the fan base gave to some of the characters like Gerard at the time. But then later, after all of that had come and gone, people were looking back. There's a lot of curiosity about that storyline. What happened? People are like, oh, that's kind of cool. So sometimes time offers a change in perspective. So now that we're in this headspace thinking about, okay, we got a 2-year standard, we got 2 blocks that are running at any given time, and 2 big story arcs. One which has kind of finished out its curve, right? You've seen all 3 sets of a block. And one which is either starting midway or also finished in standard at any given time. There's a cast of characters you're intimately familiar with. There are 2 major settings that you're intimately familiar with. You've got an ongoing story, which, maybe the story between the 2 blocks has connected, like with the Weatherlight Saga, or maybe they're more standalone, and how they connect in the greater multiverse remains to be seen. But it's very different than the sort of episodic road trip that we're on now. Let's scroll down a bit again. Here we are at the 4-set model with 4 big releases per year. This started at Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. And yes, I have been actively playing Magic since this time. I came back to Arena, built up a bunch of money, bought into a bunch of AFR on Arena when it came out, and I've been playing pretty consistently ever since. Built up a good collection of stuff, which ended up benefiting me when they changed to a 3-year rotation. But let's go over the difference for a moment. And let's pretend when we're looking at this for a second that we've got a 2-year standard happening. Right, before we switch over to the 3-year standard. Because at the start of this, we thought we had a 2-year standard. So compared to the 2 years of blocks that we just thought about, let's say that Innistrad Midnight Hunt was the oldest set currently. It was the big fall release of 2021. So, if you're looking at 2 years of standard and the stories that were being told through here, we have 2 sets that are on Innistrad. They both take place on the same plane. They have a through line, a little bit like a block. The tone and mechanics between the 2 sets are wildly different, though. In fact, a lot of people complained about how different they were. Like, they didn't have decayed zombies that went from one set to the other. Or maybe they could have foreseen that they were going to use blood tokens in Crimson Vow, and they could have peppered a few of those into Midnight Hunt. So even though they look kind of like a two-set block, they kind of aren't. They kind of don't play well together in that way. They have some synergies together, and story-wise, there is some through line there as well. Then we visit Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Cool. Very wild, very different plane. Futuristic cyberpunk in a way that Magic's never been. Then we go to Streets of New Capenna, and again, this is kind of modern feeling. Not in the same way as Neon Dynasty, but there are skyscrapers, there are business suits, there are people who have charged energy weapons. It's a very different feel from the set preceding it. There is some through line of story that's happening with the planeswalkers and such as this is occurring. But we've spent 2 sets on Innistrad, now we've gone to Kamigawa, now we've gone to New Capenna. And where Kamigawa is kind of cyberpunk, New Capenna is Art Deco noir. It's not a murder mystery noir, but it's like noir in the way of gangster movies. And, you have like a jazz band playing in the background, that kind of thing. The Roaring 20s. From there, we go back to Dominaria. And we actually stay on Dominaria for 2 sets here with a huge jump in time. Right, so now we've gotten to the big fall set of 22. But, these are still within a 2-year span of each other. So we go back to Dominaria. Now we've got this fantasy setting that's been through, multiple apocalypses and such. And Dominaria is trying to pull itself together. The next set, we go back in time to the Brothers' War. And this is a time travel set, and it tells a big story that happened over decades. One of the biggest stories in all of Magic. One which is kind of like a retelling of Antiquities. One of the oldest sets of Magic. So that's cool. It's also taking place on Dominaria, but far, far in the past. And again, there are some story through lines with the Planeswalkers and such, but whereas, this later Dominaria feels like it's trying to recover from these apocalypses and such, this version down here feels like it's, kind of young and naive and being corrupted by Phyrexian influence and by the technology of the Thran, until things, unfold into this terrible war. And it's got this kind of like giant mecha feel to it a bit, but not in a futuristic way. It feels like, giant war machines of artificers of a past technology. Maybe a little steampunk, just a little bit. Maybe aetherpunk would be a better way to describe it. Then we go to Phyrexia, All Will Be One, where Phyrexians are moving forward with their plans. Things are going well for them. And they're, about to invade the multiverse and try to conquer everything. Well, everything they can reach. Even though they invaded a whole lot of planes that have ever been referenced in the game, I still don't think Phyrexia was able to reach literally every plane. I think some were too distant, or some they haven't heard of, or some they considered unworthy of invasion because they were just like a bunch of dust and there was nothing there. Anyway, that aside, an extremely different feeling set. It's hard to even put into words what the setting of Phyrexia feels like. It's like a horror setting where this inexorable disease and a sort of zealous fascism infects everything and both changes its mindset and its body at the same time in these horrific ways, and combines technology into the mix. It's Phyrexia actually has a pretty interesting feel in terms of what it is and how it's represented. It's not easy to just splash a coat of paint on it and say, oh, this is body horror, or oh, this is cyberpunk. Or no, it's a little bit harder to explain. So that's neat. And then before we get to a 2-year rotation, which didn't happen, we go to March of the Machine, which takes place on practically everywhere in the multiverse. Phyrexia and Dominaria are a couple of interesting, more prominent vantage points, I would say, in the set. But really, every plane everywhere is taking place in March of the Machine. It's wild. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed March of the Machine. And so it's like this, end of this giant storytelling arc that happens a little bit too quickly, it turns out. It feels like Phyrexia, All Will Be One, and March of the Machine were part of a block, and that was telling a really tight story, even if they didn't have that much mechanically alike with one another. And they realized that they wanted to have another set for that block, and what they did was they made Aftermath. And they really dropped the ball there. I think in order to properly explore, the consequences of the war and some of the aftermath of what was happening, that they should have put in at least twice as many cards and made those extra 50 cards all dedicated to story spotlights. Not just like a cycle of planeswalkers that are now legends or whatever, just cards that take you to different planes and different important story beats and show you the atrocities, the heartaches, and the triumphs happening across the multiverse. And there's only the tiniest bit of that in Aftermath. Anyway. And it was a little tiny set. The tiniest set, I guess, that's ever been. If you don't count, secret layers and stuff. And then Wilds of Eldraine would have been, the 3-year mark, where it should have rotated, but then they went to a 3-year rotation. Anyway. But looking at this span of 2 years of time, to compare to the blocks that we were talking about. The number of planes we went to Innistrad, Kamigawa, that's 2, Capenna, that's 3, Dominaria, that's 4. We won't count the Brothers' War as a separate plane, but it's a very separate time and feeling. Phyrexia, that's 5. March of the Machine, that we can at least count it as 6. Potentially you could count March of the Machine as much more than that. And then Aftermath's kind of in the same boat as March of the Machine, where it takes place in multiple places. So, at a minimum, that's like 6 planes you visited, some of them at wildly different times, with wildly different themes going on. And There is a through line in the story, but sometimes it's hard to follow. It's not always easy to see it happening on the cards. It gets a little bit lost in the noise of all the new mechanics and all of the new cast of characters and new setting that you're looking at as you're jumping through on this road trip. And I think the story gets a little lost going through there. And it's easy to just kind of get tripped up on saying, oh, there's werewolves, no, there's zombies, no, there's vampires, and now there's cyberpunk, and hey, now we're in a speakeasy lounge, and then we're messing around with 5-color decks in Dominaria. You only got giant artifact creatures in the Brothers' War, and then poisoning people in Phyrexia. And then we've got battles in March of the Machine. Oh, with incubator tokens and all this funky stuff running around. And it's a little bit easier to lose the line of the story than who the important characters are, because going through this many planes, you have a huge cast of side characters. More so, I think, than you would have in 2 blocks that were set on 2 planes, telling their story arcs. There could still be a lot of side characters, don't get me wrong. But probably not to this extent. Not to the extent that, every plane has to have its own champions and its own villains and the things that flesh out their setting. And you have to do all of this at a glance as you're rapidly cycling through on to the next thing. So, if there's a problem with Magic's intellectual property here, I think it's that we don't have time to digest it. We don't have time to get introduced to it properly. Back when the blocks were going on, you knew the characters more intimately. You knew the settings more intimately. You had a lot of time to think about them and see where they were going and get attached to them or learn to hate them. In either case, you form these attachments, and when a character dies, you're either mourning their loss or you're celebrating because they're gone. And when you're moving quickly through sets like this, it's kind of like, oh, who was that? Who was that died? What were they doing again? What was their name? This rapid blitz of cycling through places has lost the storytelling element, and that is reducing the level of immersion. Right? Because the story and the people and the setting, to some extent, that is what drives the story and what creates immersion into the game. And so walking away from the block structure, we've walked away from some of those important elements of Magic's intellectual property. And so if the IP starts to come up short, I think this is why. It doesn't help that in more recent years they've done some gimmicky things. Now, there have always been some moments in Magic where it's done gimmicky stuff. I'm not saying that's never happened or that Magic has a perfect past. That's not true. But there have been several in a row. Let's scroll down again. So after Wilds of Eldraine and Lost Caverns of Ixalan, which, felt like pretty normal Magic sets to me. Didn't seem like they were, too extremely set on a meme or anything. Then we get to Murders at Karlov Manor. Now, I will defend the mechanics of the cards of Murders at Karlov Manor. I think there's a number of interesting and cool rares that are fun for deck building. I think that the set as a whole is better than people think it is. But in terms of the tone and the enormous number of detective hats, that pretty clearly fell short of the audience. People did not like it. It felt gimmicky and memey and not serious, where a murder mystery should feel very serious. Look at Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and well, no one was gonna take this one seriously, so it kind of worked. People still didn't like that all of these characters from all these different planes got shoehorned in for no apparent reason. They're like, what's Marchesa doing in Thunder Junction? What are any of these people doing in Thunder Junction other than like the ones that have to do with the actual plot of the heist? It was very silly, and it's sort of one silly set following on the heels of another silly set, where we've traded out the detective hats for cowboy hats. Now, that being said, Outlaws of Thunder Junction was kind of fun, where Murders at Karlov Manor kind of wasn't. It had a better draft environment. You could kind of laugh along with the designers with Outlaws of Thunder Junction, whereas it felt inappropriate to laugh with Murders at Karlov Manor. So, I'm not saying this was a total failure by any means, but still, it was two lighthearted, not very serious sets that felt pretty gimmicky, full of tropes. And I get to Bloomborough. A lot of people loved Bloomborough, and I'm okay with it. You know, I grew up reading things like Redwall and Watership Down and stuff. So I don't mind a plane that kind of takes on that element. Kind of cool. It also got back to the fantasy roots of the game, which, you know, Wilds of Eldraine and Ixalan felt reasonably enough like fantasy, but we'd been through two sets that didn't. So it was kind of a breath of fresh air to get back to swords and magic again, even if they were wielded by cute little critters. I don't think Bloomborough was perfect. I'm not going to heap praise on it, just like I'm not going to heap scorn on it. I think it was fine. Then we get to Duskborn, House of Horror. And I think this one wouldn't have felt quite so memey and tropified if they'd just left off the survivors in their immaculate clothes with their big, silly technological devices that look polished and shining and brand new. When theoretically these are people who are like scraping together an existence in this cursed house that's all occupied by this demon, and they're having to like scrap together their clothing and their bits of technology to build things as best they can. Everything should look like it's apocalyptic as far as I'm concerned. Not like the Ghostbusters. If they had left that out, I think Duskmorn actually has a pretty interesting setting. I think it's actually kind of cool. But since they left that bit in, it ends up making it feel kind of memey and silly a bit where it shouldn't. It should feel kind of dark and horrifying, you know? In terms of tone, Duskborn and Murders at Karlov Manor should have been like the dark sets. You know, the sets where people are having a hard time and there's like murders and mysteries and death happening. And both of them have their reasons why they have distractions from that story. I don't think Duskmorn is, you know, terrible in terms of its setting. I think they just made some creative decisions that distracted from it in a way that was really unnecessary. It could have been a lot cooler if they had left those out. Still, I don't think it's a total failure. I think it's okay. I kind of enjoy it. But yeah, so these four sets here, after Wilds of Eldraine and Ixalan, for various reasons, you could accuse each of them of being kind of memey or tropey, with Bloomborough being the one that people are most forgiving of, and Murders at Karlov Manor apparently being the one that people are least forgiving of. So what about after this? Maybe this year was just kind of a fluke. What about next year? Oh dear. Ether Drift. Ether Drift is a death race. A la the old movie Death Race 3000. Or if anyone remembers the Hanna-Barbera cartoon Wacky Races. It's, or I guess kind of like Mario Kart or whatever. I'm pretty sure Ether Drift is going to be silly. Probably silly in the way that Thunder Junction is, where it doesn't take itself seriously, but it can still be kind of like over the top and fun at times. So kind of goofy, but maybe in a fun way. I hope. I hope. That's really the best I can hope for from it, I guess. Um, at the worst, um, I guess they put everyone in racing helmets and they ruin all three planes that they included as part of Ether Drift. Um, I I have a little bit more confidence in it than that, but it's going to be a silly set. Tarkir Dragonstorm. Now, I think we finally got back to a set here that takes itself seriously in the Magic canon and has a fantasy feel to it. So, depending on what you think of Bloomburrow, maybe you take that set seriously. Maybe you don't feel like it's all memes and tropes. I would understand why you could feel that way, though. So, depending on Bloomburrow, we've either had like 4 out of 5 sets be kind of memey and ridiculous, or 5 out of 5 sets. All in a row. Before we get to Tarkir Dragonstorm. And there's going to be some universes beyond peppered in here that are not on this list. Because I suppose they've organized it differently on Wikipedia for the moment. Maybe that'll change in the future. But yeah, we're going to be seeing Final Fantasy tucked in here. And then after Tarkir, we're going to be seeing Spider-Man. And, I mean, those basically have no story. There is no through line. There are no important characters. They're like blanks. If you thought Outlaws of Thunder Junction, Murders at Karlov Manor, or Ether Drift are silly, then compared to those, Final Fantasy and Spider-Man have no story at all. They have nothing that is a through line with the rest of Magic. I will say at least that Final Fantasy is something of a fantasy setting. I guess it feels a bit like Etherpunk. There's high technology in it. There are guns. There are factories. So, but at the same time, it's got swords and magic and such. So, I think the feel of Final Fantasy will be closer to what you would expect from Magic. But story-wise, there aren't going to be planeswalkers carrying through, some sort of a plot arc. That's not happening there. So, as I said, those are blanks. Then we have Edge of Eternities. Edge of Eternities is going to be a space-themed set, and I don't know what that means for Magic exactly. So before I go accusing it of being silly and being tropey and not taking itself seriously, let's at least give Edge of Eternities the benefit of the doubt for a second. It could actually have a lot of interesting play with the Blind Eternities and talking about the structure of the planes of Magic. I think there is a way that Edge of Eternities could be really cool and could be in canon with Magic and could feel actually amazing. So, I see an alternate timeline where it's like full of Star Wars and Star Trek memes and stupid like 1950s aliens and B movies and stuff. But I think there's also a chance it could be really relevant to Magic, the setting, and the story. So, I'm going to say the jury's out on Edge of Eternities. I won't try to go any further than that. They already pushed back Lorwyn to make room for Universes Beyond entering Standard. Who knows what 2026 will look like. They'll probably change the schedule. So, and there'll be another Universes Beyond set next year, and we don't know what it is yet. I'm going to guess it's another Marvel set, but I could be wrong. So out of these, last several in-universe sets, quite a number of them either are memey and ridiculous or have the potential to be memey and ridiculous, or some portion of the audience received them that way. It's easy to lose the through line of the story, as I said, when you're bopping around from place to place and you have to introduce a bunch of new characters and a new setting. You can lose track of who the main character is and what story you're actually supposed to be paying attention to that's in progress. And I think going back to blocks could save Magic's IP in a way that they're just not willing to embrace right now. I don't think it's that they can't do it. Of course they could do it, but they don't wanna. Maybe they feel like that ship has sailed, or maybe they can't convince their corporate overlords at Hasbro that it would be a good idea. Maybe Hasbro simply does not want to, under any circumstances, go back to 3 set releases a year. Plus like a, core set. What can you do with that? Well, what I'm doing with that is I'm making my own block. And I'm developing my own formats. What's legal in those formats, how you play those formats. And I'd like to develop my own free tournaments that I put on with prize support, cost nothing to enter, that can use some of the new cards from the blocks that I'm creating, where I'm trying to save the heart of Magic. Where it's taking place in Magic Universe, it's creating stories that develop on things that have come before. And it ties in with existing bits of story. While ignoring what's going on after a certain point, because there's a lot of noise there, and I feel like it'd be better to just kind of create an alternate story, an alternate timeline branching off from what Hasbro's doing. And I think if we work together as a community, then instead of just being one guy's crazy idea, it could be a reality. I'm going to keep pushing for it even if it seems distant and crazy and unreachable. Let me know what you think. You can check out the video I put out before this one if you want to know more. Anyway, I'll keep covering Arena. Arena's free to play, so I'll be there some amount of the time. And I'll keep talking about Magic. Please like and subscribe. Check out my other videos. And until next time, never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.